Hello everyone and welcome. For today's topic number 5, we'll discuss soils. Thank you so much for being here with me. I appreciate you taking the time. You could have been anywhere else and you're using the time to watch this video. Without further ado, let's get right to it. Very well. So soils. I guess the first thing that comes at least to my mind when I think of soils is the solid material that you'd go and find outside when you're just playing in dirt, right? And it's either very thick, very thin, but kind of like the dirty part of outdoors, right? Well, to get really to it, soils is really the weathering of rock. And usually rock is in the form of mountains and so on. So that kind of weathering can be chemical, mechanical, right? And it reduces the sizes of that rock to smaller or slightly larger particles. And I think at this point then, one big distinction that I'd like to make you aware of is this. Soil can be distinguished, the solid part of soil can be distinguished into two broad categories. Coarse grain soil, which is basically soil made up of particles that are greater than 0.075 millimeters in size. Coarse grain soil, kind of like the gravel you see here. And then you also have fine grain soil, which is soil whose particles are smaller than 0.075 millimeters. These are fine grained soils, okay? But here's the thing, okay? Soils as a construction material are actually not as simple as you would think at first glance. Soils, in fact, are made up of more than just the solids we think of, like I'm showing for you on the screen here. Soils are actually considered some of the most complex construction materials. And that's because soils, when they're used for construction purposes and when they're considered for construction purposes, comprise also water and air. It is solids, water, and air that make up soils as we know it as construction materials. And just a reminder that what I'm covering in terms of soils for the purposes of our course is liberally based on chapters 11 and 12 of your textbook, third edition of the textbook for this course. Now, knowing about soils is very important because as long as you prepare properly when you're designing your structure and your building and you consider the soils you're going to be building on, can you achieve feats of construction like the ones shown here? Okay, do you recognize this skyline? Great, great. This is the skyline for the Burj, for Dubai, right? Where the Burj Khalifa is prominently displayed. Okay, so knowing about soils allows humankind to achieve feats of engineering like this one with the tallest structure ever built, right? Or it allows feats of construction like the one here with this time lapse that I'm showing you on the right hand side of your screen. Do you recognize this? Yeah, it's Pisa, right? With the Leaning Tower featuring prominently. So many hundreds of years of difference in construction, right? And the interesting thing about, say, the Burj Khalifa and the Tower of Pisa is that they're famous for opposite reasons. The Burj Khalifa, it was meant to be an achievement in human ingenuity and construction. It was meant to be the tallest building structure ever built by humanity, and it was done. This was achieved by considering, among other things, the soil under the building. It is the tallest building ever, the tallest structure ever, and it's done so because it's also straight, right? It's meant to be exactly the way it was built. Not so for the Tower of Pisa, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It was meant to be an achievement at the time when the intention was to be built. However, during its construction, it went from being straight to not quite, right? It started leaning while it was being built. And that's because the people that were in charge of building it had not properly considered the properties of the soil under this building. So even during construction, then you can notice that the builders tried to straighten out to the tower by changing the sizes of the some of the stories. So anyways, these two achievements in human construction and ingenuity are famous for two opposing reasons. The first one, Burj Khalifa, meant to be straight, an achievement, and it was so because they properly considered the properties of the soil under the building, among other things. The second one, the Tower of Pisa, it's an achievement because they didn't consider the properties of the soil under that building. Now here's the thing about soils, okay? Soils are very complex as a building material. As you can see from this video, soils that may appear to be solid, once you actually apply a load to them, may behave quite differently from a solid material. That's why soils are considered probably the most complex building material because they're made up of solids, liquid, and air. Very well. We have an example of a notorious building for which the properties of the soil under the building wasn't properly considered, and this is the Museum of Nature in Ottawa. It's displayed here in its various stages. You can see here the original construction of the building with the tower that's displayed here, the original tower. And this tower actually started to sink and move away from the main building soon after the construction of the Museum of Nature was completed in about 1910. Okay, so it started separating from the main building, and there were cracks up to 300 millimeters in width that were forming in the tower. So then that tower was partially demolished so that the dead loads on that portion of the building could be reduced and these separations and cracks could be minimized if not stopped, okay? Then, in early 2000s, there was an intention to bring back that tower back to life. And what was done is that tower was reimagined as a lantern. And the interesting thing about the structure of this lantern is that it was set up so that it would not actually bear on the original footings. Instead, they're kind of hung on this steel structure that is fastened back to the main building and also bears on a new set of footings that are under the original ones. I'm going to link for you a video for this showing kind of the construction information about the Museum of Nature. It's a short video. It's going to be linked for you in the description of this video. But anyways, what we're trying to do, and what I'm trying to get across when it comes to soils is this. Soils are important because they are literally the base upon which you build any of your structures. And you want to prevent the soils you build upon from becoming a quicksand, like I'm satirizing with this video that I posted for you on the screen, right? This is an image of how Hollywood depicts quicksand and how it affects human, right? It's a fictionalized view of that. And you sink in it, according to Hollywood. Well, you don't want that to happen with buildings, because that would be, and this is the technical term, really bad. So knowing about soils will prevent catastrophic failures to the buildings, to the structures that you will work on and design. And hopefully this lesson will kind of cover that a little bit. Okay? So that's where geotechnical investigations come into play. I'm putting on the screen for you just the table of contents for the geotechnical investigation that was done for the ACE building, right, where we do most of our courses at Algonquin College. And this covers the whole site. And look at this. This geotechnical investigation, just the table of contents, is 6 pages. The whole report is hundreds of pages, right? Because it needs to cover a whole bunch of information. The purpose of a geotechnical report is that it allows those who carry it out to gather information relating to the properties of the soil on the site where you plan to build. They are there also to investigate the contaminants, whether or not there are any contaminants or pollutants present on that soil. And the report would also include aspects associated with the excavation of the soil. So making sure that if you go and build in that soil and dig up, you figure out what the soil slopes need to be for stability purposes. It also is there to figure out what the water table is, right? The level of the water. To take soil samples while you're on site at various depths to assess the properties of various soils at various depths. It also helps with figuring out how much soil may settle after construction, right? After you put a building in there, how much that may or may not settle. It also will provide the recommendations then on, say, whether or not even to build on there, because say if the soil is so poor that you can't, then maybe you can't build, or if you do plan on building, that the soil needs to be taken out and engineered soil needs to be put back into place. So recommendations on how to replace soil, how to reinforce soils, and recommendations then on what foundations and footing systems to use. All the soil samples then that are taken on site as part of the geotechnical investigation may also then be taken back to a lab so that those samples may be analyzed further to determine the properties of the soil at that site and the ability then of that soil to support buildings, the structure that you want to put in place. Okay. Now, some of the ways that you do your on-site investigations are shown for you on the screen. I'm covering 3 of them. The first one is test pits, and as the name suggests, it is really just that. You basically make a big hole on site, and these are probably a way that is the best because they provide a large enough hole for you to do a visual inspection of the soil and to get samples of the soil, right? You get to see it right there and there because you get in the pit and you take the samples. It is considered probably the most reliable method because it allows direct inspection and assessment of several properties of the soil undisturbed, right? Typically, they're less than 8 feet deep, so that's one of the limitations because you can't go any deeper than that, otherwise the pit has to be huge. It permits the observations of the soil samples directly, and it may allow you to figure out the depth of the water table on that site, maybe, if you're lucky. But it does come at some disadvantages. Test pits are really expensive, right? Especially if you have to make many of them. Especially if you have to go deep, because the deeper you go, the bigger the pit has to be to prevent a cave-in, right, of the sides of the pit. And if the water table is high, the test pit cannot be too deep. So if the water table is close to the surface, you can't go very deep with your test pit because you can't excavate. Okay? So that's where, for example, something like a hand auger sampling method will come into play. This is more common for small jobs, okay? Especially where visual qualitative inspections are required. And literally what you do is you grab what is a huge corkscrew and then you screw that into the ground to a certain depth and then you pull it out and you inspect the soil that you're pulling out at various depths. That's what that is. The most commonly used method for on-site acquisition of samples and inspection of the soil properties is the boring, the test boring, basically doing boreholes. And this is basically it involves grabbing soil samples by using a truck-mounted, power-driven hollow stem that is fitted at the end of this rig, and then it's usually typically drilled into the ground to various depths. It is great for going to very deep sampling, unless there is refusal, right, if you hit bedrock. Also, with this setup, you can go to a site and you can do multiple boreholes in one shot, right, during the day. And it allows you then to sample at various depths so you can bring those samples, those cores, back to the lab. Once you do the cores, okay, those cores are able to show you to display the log, or I guess the profile of the soil where you're drilling, and that also allows you to create a log of the bores, or a borehole log, like the one that you see here, which I've taken straight out of your textbook. Okay. Now, Once you do something like this, then you take your samples back to the lab and you do various types of tests. I've taken these images straight out of your textbook, okay? So that's where they're taken from. And I will discuss these tests, link more to them in the description by doing a second video. But I want you to know that I'll never test you on these specific tests. You should just be aware of what they are so you can converse with others in the field or in your business related when it comes to relating to these soil tests. Okay. So when it comes to then classifying the soil so you can figure out what the properties of the soil are that you're going to be analyzing, right, for a job site, for a construction, the first big distinction is differentiating between coarse or fine grain material, like I'm showing here on the screen. Now, only separating between coarse material and fine material is not sufficient. You have to get a lot more detailed than just that, right? You can't just take the soil on site and just say, I've identified the chunk of that soil that is coarse and identified the chunk of that soil that is fine. That's not enough. You have to do more than that. And how is this done? Why is it done? Okay. As it turns out, if we know the soil composition, right, for a sample, we know its strength. So if we're able to classify the distribution of the solid particles in a soil, we can actually estimate the strength of that soil. And if we know the strength of that soil, we know how much load it can support, right? For whatever building or structure you're planning on putting on it. It's basically like a recipe, if you will. So the idea then, first of all, is to separate between the coarse grain soils and fine grain soils, okay? And this is done by using the testing that you see on the left-hand side, by using sieves. So basically sieves are filters, meshes, if you will. And the sieves at the top, the meshes there are spaced far apart, and the sieves at the bottom, the meshes are spaced close together, so that the larger particles are captured at the top when you pour the sample in it, and the finer particles go below. And this big separation at 0.075 millimeters is a critical one because it distinguishes between coarse grain soils and fine grain soils. Now, the reason that's important is because coarse grain soils behave very specifically. They are so-called non-cohesive soils. And we'll chat about that in a moment, what that means, okay? So that first big classification, separating between fine-grained and coarse-grained, is critical, because then you know if that soil is cohesive or non-cohesive, which then brings us to then the fine-grained soils. Fine-grained soils cannot be figured out by using sieves, right? The ones here, because the meshes cannot be made small enough to separate these fine materials, okay? And I should also mention, non-cohesive soils, coarse-grained soils, those include sand and gravel, okay? Non-cohesive soil, the fine ones, they include clay and silt, and they're so fine that meshes are not good enough, okay? There are other ways of figuring out the quality of that kind of soil for strength purposes, which gets us to then cohesive and non-cohesive soils. Why do we care? Why is this threshold of 0.075 important? Because soils, again, is not just about the solids, it is about also water, right? Don't forget, soils are made up of solids, water, and air. And when it comes to the fine soils, silts and clay, seeing how they behave in the presence of water is critical. Because something like clay particles are so small and so shaped that they bond with water, they interact with water at a molecular level. Okay, so for these fine particles, the fine soil, It is about how they behave in the presence of water. So first, I guess, before I jump into explaining cohesive and non-cohesive soils, I want to give you an idea of the relative size of the particles for sand, silt, and clay. Okay? Now, because some of these are so small, we have to use an analogy. If we pretended that sand particles, okay, were the size of a beach ball, then silt, which is smaller than sand, a silt particle would be the size of a tennis ball. Okay, a beach ball versus a tennis ball, more or less. Which means then that a clay particle would be the size of a grain of rice. Okay, so you can start to see then, if you remember how big a grain of sand is, right? Bring it down proportionally from a beach ball to a tennis ball to a grain of sand. That's how small clay particles and silt particles are. Okay, which then brings us to this. Okay, cohesive versus non-cohesive. Cohesive material is the kind that basically in the presence of water sticks to each other. Okay, so silt and clay in the presence of water, when they get wet, they tend to stick to themselves. That's why you can mold clay to give it a shape. Whereas non-cohesive soils in the presence of water don't stick with each other. Gravel, when you wet gravel and you put it together, it still falls apart. It doesn't want to stick with itself when it's wet. So this is important because, say, in the case of excavations, when you're excavating soil, knowing whether or not that soil is cohesive or not is important, because if the soil is cohesive in the presence of water, you can slope it at a certain slope. If it is not cohesive and you slope it too steeply, the sides of that excavation can fall into the excavation and hurt people. So let me give an example, okay? Let's say if this were stable rock, if it were a stable rock, you can cut rock at 90 degrees. It won't fall into itself, right? It's solid. Now, if we move on to cohesive soil, like say clay or sandy clay, you can slope it as much as 53 degrees as you see here. Okay, it's still good. When you go to less cohesive soil like gravel and silt, okay, gravel and silt can go up to 45 degrees. No more. If it's more than 45 degrees, it's dangerous. When you get to something like sand and dirt, it's non-cohesive, right? The presence of water does nothing. So usually slope excavations stay at 34 degrees and no more. Okay. So now I want to jump into, I guess, the more details of the effect of water on fine-grained soils. Okay. So that means that we should talk about plasticity index as it shows here on the screen. The details of the test that I'm showing for you on the screen will be covered in part 2 of the video. And that will be linked for you, I guess, at the bottom of the description of this video. But I want to remind you that the tests that I will be discussing in part 2 of the video are FYI, for your information only. I'm not going to test you on the details of the test, and you're not expected to know the details of the test because you're never going to carry them out as part of your education. You may in your professional practice, but that's beyond the scope of this course. So now, about the plasticity index, okay? The plasticity index relates to something called the plastic limit and the liquid limit of soil. So let's start with the plastic limit. The plastic limit is the amount of water that needs to be added to a dry sample of soil that will then get it to turn into a putty-like substance. Think semi-solid putty, okay? It may have some shape that may retain, and you may be able to apply some load. But it's basically that amount of water that you can add to a sample of soil that gets it to stop really supporting most of the load, because it can be then shaped, okay? The liquid limit is then the amount of water that you need to add to a sample of soil to turn that sample into liquid. And I'm not saying pourable, I'm saying that that soil no longer retains a shape on its own and is no longer able to support any load. It's slurry. And when soil actually reaches this type of stage, it typically results in catastrophic failures of the soil and whatever structure is attached to it and whatever nature is associated with it. So then, what is the plasticity index? The plasticity index, PI, is simply defined as the difference between the liquid limit and the plastic limit. And I want to indicate that when I say amount of water for both the plastic limit and the liquid limit, I mean the percentage of water by volume that needs to be added to a soil sample. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about plasticity index is that it allows you to compare soils and to identify the behavior of soil. So let's say if we have, I don't know, 2 soil samples where the liquid limit is the same for both samples, but the plasticity index is different. The soil sample with the larger plasticity index, if they both have the same liquid limit, then will be more susceptible to swelling in the presence of moisture and shrinkage when moisture is removed, right? Because it basically can absorb more water, okay? This is true specifically for fine-grained soils, which are most susceptible to change in volume based on moisture content. So then, let's now discuss expansive soils. Expansive soils relate to fine-grained soils that are basically susceptible to change in their volume based on the moisture content. Basically, when the volume of the soil sample goes up with the addition of water, then that soil swells. When you take water away and the volume goes down of that soil, that's considered shrinkage. Okay? More specifically, we would get highly expansive soils when the liquid limit for that soil is more than 50% and the plasticity index is more than 30%. This is soil that you have to be careful building on because the presence of moisture, of water in the soil, causes big changes in the level of that soil, right? So shrinkage or sinking of your buildings, or expansion or movement of your buildings, okay? Mediumly expansive soils usually have a liquid limit that's between 25% and 50%, and a plasticity index that is between 15 and 30%. Stable soils typically have a liquid limit less than 25%, and a plasticity index that's less than 15%. This becomes very important when it comes to figuring out the effects of moistures on soils, and therefore the effects of the soils on the buildings that they're supporting, right? Here we go. Why? Soil liquefaction is one example. Soil is such a complex material, construction material, that simply because it looks stable and solid does not mean it is meant for construction. Right? I'm giving you here 2 examples of soils that start off by looking okay, but once you actually apply any load to them, they stop behaving as solids and behave more as liquids. Basically, this is a phenomenon of soil liquefaction. So this phenomenon is especially a problem in seismic areas because if you have a building built on this kind of soil and you have an earthquake, you're shaking the whole setup. And when that happens, the soil under the building liquefies. Literally. It still looks solids, but it behaves like a liquid. And your building sinks in it, and your building moves with it. It's catastrophic. Okay? And I will link for you, actually, for the purposes of part 2, below. I'm going to link for you examples of soil liquefaction, the effects of soils that cause shrinking and therefore the settlement of buildings, the swelling of buildings, even how soil liquefaction has been done at Algonquin College. They're all going to be in part 2 of the video. Again, it's going to be linked for you at the bottom. And this is important because assuming that you do everything right, if you don't do everything quite right, you can get different settlement of buildings. You can get no settlement of a building. That's great. You've done everything right. You can get uniform settlement of a building, that is, the whole building sinks or moves the same rate. Or you can get differential settlement of a building, which is bad, the worst of these situations. Okay, but that's all this is about when it comes to soil, is making sure that you know the properties of the soil upon which you plan to build, so that if they're good enough to support what you put on it, you're good. If they're not good enough to build on it, then you know, so you can respond to it, right? Because really, this is the whole point. We want to figure out, for the soil we want to build on, what that soil's bearing capacity is. This is a term you need to make sure you know. Soil bearing capacity is the fancy engineering term for strength of that soil. Okay, so basically how much force it can take while still holding things up, which then influences the design, the dimensions of the foundation walls of your structure, of the footings of your structure, right? Because typically your footings and foundation walls are going to be made of very rigid material. Definitely more rigid than your soil you're putting it on. So you don't want those foundations and footings to punch through your soil, which is usually softer than your foundations and footings. So you have to kind of spread the weight of the building coming down to a wide enough footing so that it balances out with the strength of the soil under it. Because you want to prevent this from happening, right? You don't want your building to sink as if it were in quicksand. In technical terms, this is really bad, and you don't want really bad. Okay, so I want to direct you, for your information, to table 9.4.4.1 of the Ontario Building Code. This is where we can find some bearing capacities of different kinds of soil. You should be familiar with this because we will be using these quantities for the purposes of tests, final exams, and some examples that I'll be covering shortly. Also, this methodology of figuring out the bearing capacity of different kinds of soils is a simplified way of doing it, right? It's based on the conceptual expectation from these different kinds of soils. It will be good enough for our purposes. Which then brings us to this. I am going to cover 3 examples. They're all going to be linked for you at the bottom. Example number 1, which you see on the screen now, is an example where we are going to assume that the soil under this pad footing is loose sand. We're going to assume that the footing measures 800 millimeters by 800 millimeters, and I'm going to give you a value of force that's coming down from the building above. We're going to be able to figure out with example number 1 whether or not this footing, sized as it is good enough. Check it out. Example number 1 is linked for you at the bottom in the description. For example number 2, which is linked for you at the bottom in the description of this video, we're going to assume that this soil is loose sand, but it could be any other kind of soil from the table in part 9. And based on that, and a certain force that I'm going to be guesstimating from the building above, we're actually going to figure out, according to part 9, so in a simplified fashion, what the dimensions of the pad footing are. Lastly, with example number 3, for this configuration, we're going to actually figure out what kind of soil would be expected to be under this pad footing given certain parameters. Okay? And part 3 for you is also going to be linked at the bottom in the description. That's it. Part 1 of the video related to soils comes to an end. Thank you so much for your time. Don't forget that part 2 is linked at the bottom in the description, and check out the examples as well. Thank you so much, and have a lovely day.